Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, this is Stephen from Project Tech. We're going to get started in just a minute. If you have any questions throughout this, please feel free to ask. I want this to be as interactive as possible. So you can help drive the direction as we go. Like I said, we'll get started in about another minute or two. All right. Once again, I'm Stephen Shaw. I'm going to be covering a basic intro into automation scripts. And it's a slight different take than a lot of things, hopefully, in that a lot of times you'll get very specific examples of here's how to do X with an automation script, and we'll definitely cover that. But one of the big things that I wanted to focus on as part of this is kind of explaining when to use an automation script. You know, once you start having the capabilities of with the power behind automation scripts that can allow you to do many things that previously weren't possible. We often see some customers go too far to one extreme where they're starting to use automation scripts for everything. And just like anything, it's definitely a balancing act. You know, make sure you use the right tool for the right situation. So I hope to cover a little bit of both of that. I've been working with Maximo for about 10 years at this point, supporting a bunch of different customers in our cloud. The nice part about automation scripts for us is, you know, our big focus is high availability, right? So anytime you're in a cloud solution, the idea of taking down a Maximo system, not exactly ideal. So this kind of has been a big focus of ours ever since the initial 7.5 release, way back in 2011, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot of good stuff. Let's get started. So again, why automation scripts? So the biggest thing is you start to hit walls with the out-of-the-box configuration. As far as products go, Maximo is by far the best configurable product I've ever seen. It's easy to add new attributes, add new applications, reports, whatever you need to do, it's pretty configurable. But there's always going to be scenarios that go above and beyond that configuration, right? You want to add some additional validation to an object, restrict certain values in certain situations. That kind of flexibility is not really there in the core product. So you occasionally have to write an automation script there. So why would you choose automation scripts over custom Java? So if you've been writing custom Java for a long period of time, first question that people ask, why switch? And really it comes down to two serious factors. We kind of talked about initially on the intro, application availability is huge. Automation scripts give you such great capabilities where you can disable an automation script even while the app is up. You can deploy new automation scripts. You can make changes to those automation scripts. Your users who are trying to build these automation scripts don't need to have the entire Maximo install locally so that they can build them. Most of the time when we're writing automation scripts, they're relatively simple. So you're not even decompiling Java to try to figure out what to do. So in those cases, you can just write a simple Python or JavaScript script, deploy it into Maximo, and avoid an outage entirely. But speed of development also kind of ties into more than just that. It really becomes really flexible when you have certain customizations that are repeated, right? So in Maximo, if you're doing Java classes, you're going to be doing typically in either an MBO set class, or you're going to be dealing with field level classes. Automation scripts kind of give you the flexibility that you can launch at various events, all from within one single script. So not only can it make it easier to develop, you really have a central place for that code. So if you need to make a change, you can make a change in one place and potentially impact multiple launch points. So it really makes it easier for people to get started. The list kind of goes on and on. Don't want to spend too much time on this, but definitely if you guys have questions, feel free to reach out. So I kind of want to start with a couple of examples. The first one for me is defaulting values on new records. And like I said, one of the big things to decide is when to use an automation script and which automation script event to use over some of the out-of-the-box configuration options. So database default values are pretty common, and they're very useful. There's some flexibility with dynamic fields. So like, for example, if you want to default a person or the current system date time, you have all that flexibility in there. Where it becomes kind of more limiting is when you're trying to default based on something else. So for example, if you have a child record and you want to default say the PO number as an example from the header, you can't really do that with a database default value. And anytime it's not static text, such as like a labor code, for instance, there's not a labor code for a given person necessarily, because labor is at an organizational level. And so while you may have labor code X and org Y, you may have a completely different labor code in organization Z. And so trying to get some of those more complicated scenarios doesn't really work there. But if you're doing really static defaults, database default values make way more sense than trying to do an automation script. Application default value control kind of introduces an interesting element to it, and that is in Application Designer, you have the capability to put in a default value control. And again, if you're doing really static values, it's not too bad. The big thing to be aware of, it's only going to happen inside that one application. So if you take something like work orders, for instance, where you may be managing it in quick reporting, in work order tracking, or you may even have various industry solutions or add-ons that have their own version of work order tracking, that would be a problem that you would have to implement. There is one interesting use case, though, that application default values provide, and that is if you take PO as an example, out of box, on the lines tab, there's a special section, and that section is defined as a default input. And what it allows you to do is if you're going to be referencing the same work order number over and over again, your users can actually specify that work order number on that default value section. And then as they add in new lines, those new lines will automatically inherit. So when you need to kind of give that user configurable default and allow them to do it in bulk, it actually can save them quite a bit of time. So it's a good use case of that. I'm going to really quickly talk about app field defaults, because to me, this is the worst option almost in every case. But essentially inside of the database, there's this app field defaults table that allows you to specify group, user, app, kind of various defaults. It's still static, but unlike everything else on here, it's going to require an outage to take effect. So you have to restart the system. It's not super obvious. A lot of people who work with Maximo aren't extremely familiar with this, so they may have no idea where that default is coming from. And again, if there's an issue with it, there's no real way for you to stop it. You have to remove the entry, restart the system. It's not very clean. So now we're going to talk about the 3 automation script options: initialize, save, and object name new. So these we're going to talk about a little more in detail. When you get the slide deck, I actually have detailed slides on the top 3, and you'll be able to get some more information on those if you're interested in some of the out of the box, when to use them, when not to. So on object structure, automation script initialize, way back when, in 7.5 of Maximo in particular, there was no real good way to default a value from an automation script. So if you wanted somebody to interactively see that there's going to be this new value, such as soon as you hit new row or add in a record, you really kind of had to use initialize. The problem with initialize is that it fires a lot more than people realize. So especially if you're doing an object initialize event, what's happening behind the scenes is if you're displaying data in a result set portlet on your start center, or if you're actually displaying, pulling data through the REST API, or if you're displaying data on the list tab, all of those, that initialize event is still firing. So even if you're providing a check to say, hey, don't run this unless we're being, a new record is being added, there's still overhead to kind of handle launching that automation script and seeing what state you're currently in. And so because of that, it really slows down some of those large processes. While it may look good on creating the one record, may not add a lot of overhead to that, you just have to be aware this is running a lot. At this point, we don't typically recommend it for defaulting values. Initialize, especially at the attribute level, still has a lot of good use cases, especially if you're dealing with non-persistent objects or attributes. So not saying you'll never use them, but purely for the use case of defaulting a value on record creation, not a good use case for that. So then you kind of have the option of launching on save. And so this one is kind of useful because certain situations depend on users to do something else. So for example, if you're trying to provide defaults and potentially load data into a child record that the user may not even see, save tends to become a good option for that. If it potentially only defaults when the user doesn't provide something, waiting until they choose to save the record is really kind of the last part of that process. So it really kind of gives you the ability to wait and say, hey, here's this other logic that I need to evaluate. And so when we get into this EMX QBR All, which I'll demo in just a second, the situation there was pretty simple, right? All we wanted to do is, as a new QBR got added, we wanted to enable a group to have access to it if it was a non-public report. The thing kind of ties into a more overall enhancement, but the basic logic behind it is really easy. If someone hasn't set it to be public, there are no groups associated to that QBR, and we still need to enable this particular group to be able to access that report. So show that one in a second. In 7.6, IBM implemented a significantly better way. So if you create a script with the name specifically, whatever the object name is, such as SR or work order or WO activity, and then .new, that'll automatically launch. There's no launch points, but what this will do is this fires immediately after any of the core MBO add logic. So if something were to put in auto numbers or sequences or any of that core Maximo default logic, that stuff would have already happened. And then you can kind of do your processing. But similar to the interactive, this is great because it happens immediately. So as soon as a user goes and says, hey, let me add this record or add this line, your automation script will fire. And unlike the initialize, it's only going to fire once. So you don't have to worry about checking if something's on add. You don't have to worry about it firing if somebody is on the list tab, on the result set portlets, etc. This kind of gives you a great way to kind of check for that before you process it. So I'm going to quickly kind of show you these two because I know PowerPoints tend to drag on. So let's try to go through these two automation scripts. So as I was kind of alluding to earlier, EMX QBR All is something we built on for QBRs. So as a user goes and saves a QBR report, which you can determine based on the user ID not being null, and only on add because we only need to do this once. What we do is we go through and we check to see if the report authorization is empty. So what that means is, are there any records there? If not, we know that it's going to be a public, or if there are, we know it's going to be a public report because it'll have an everyone group associated to it. If not, we're going to go through and we add it. Again, this is really one small part of a larger thing to ensure that reports run as a particular user to kind of control the send from address. But essentially, the actual logic for this is pretty simple. It's really all about just going in and saying, hey, we need to make sure that this group gets added to any QBRs that get created, and this would kind of go through and do that for us. Because the record is going to be saved, we don't do anything explicitly to call a save. So even though I'm adding a new record, there's nothing in here about saving. The Maximo framework will automatically save this in this context. So this one's kind of a pretty straightforward one. So now let me go to LabTrans new. So this one is a more interesting example because we often get where people don't realize this a lot, but if you go into Maximo and you go and you typically, you try to add a new labor record on your actuals, what'll happen is by default, nothing will be there. So you won't have your labor code or anything like that. So if I disable this and I go and I say new record, your users are literally going in here and they're gonna have to type in, oh, I'm Wilson, which by typing in Wilson, after the asynchronous validation occurs, that'll set your craft and everything like that. And that's fine. But the problem is, if you're doing that and you're doing that many times a day, that really kind of slows you down. And so what a lot of people will do is they'll use a database default on person, and they'll use something like person ID or username. And most cases for a system, that's okay, because most of the time people try to make the labor code match the person ID, but that's not a guaranteed match. Nothing about labor specifically requires that your labor code matches your person ID. And so what we want to do is we want to try and sit there and say, hey, let's grab the actual labor code for this particular person and make sure that defaults on records. So when we go through that, it's pretty simple. Because we already know, we can pull the person ID using a similar function that exists. It's a special variable that Maximo has similar to sysstate, where that'll allow me to retrieve the person ID of the logged in user. And because our LabTrans record is going to have an org ID set by the user creating it, I can go and I can get that labor record. Now, one of the important things that we like to do when we're just trying to read data from a related set, it's really good to try and set this discardable flag, because what this does is this tells the framework, hey, I'm not going to modify this record in any way, shape, or form. And it allows the framework to release it faster. So anytime you're doing large data sets, especially the fewer MBO sets that you have in memory, the better. So when you know you're never going to update that record, like in this case, all I'm trying to do is get the labor code for our current user. There's no real need to try to keep it. So setting that flag is important. And then we just kind of get that record, if we have a record, because labor is not something that necessarily exists for every user. Max admin out of box, not going to have a labor code. And the last thing you want to do is assume it exists and then generate errors when someone's trying to add a record. But assuming we get one, I'm going to bring in that labor code, set it automatically. And then I added another little piece because when you start to use like labor reporting, for instance, some customers have different use cases. So for us, labor reporting really comes down to I'm trying to record admin time, whether it be meetings or training or this, that, whatever. And a labor transaction requires some sort of data on it. It needs to have a work order, an asset, GL account, location, etc. And so because those admin type transactions aren't really important, we're not really trying to reflect that cost directly against a particular record. What we do is we just kind of set a dummy location that kind of serves that purpose. So if I go and I activate this now, I'll go back and refetch this record. And what'll happen is now automatically Wilson set the craft piece is automatic by setting this labor code. And then if I went into, say, labor reporting, again, if I create a new record, now it'll set that, but it'll also set this location. So now at this point, I can just enter my hours, potentially change my type of work. And then from there, again, it's all about trying to streamline the data entry. And that's kind of something you wouldn't really be able to do with just standard Maximo configuration. So this was kind of a good use case for that. All right, let me see if we have any questions really quick. Sorry, this question panel is tiny. There we go. Purchase maintenance. So one of the questions is around predictive versus preventative maintenance. This is definitely not going to cover any of those specifically. So obviously, as an industry, predictive maintenance is kind of a big push. Maximo's always had really good preventive maintenance scheduling, and we'll actually in just a second actually talk about a PM example. But another question was about if you would set the craft, and yeah, if you wanted to kind of change how Maximo functions, say if you had multiple crafts and you wanted to pick potentially based on data that existed, say on the work order, for instance, you could definitely do that in the default script as well. So it really kind of depends on how you would be building that customization to kind of determine it. So like for instance, if you were trying to look at plan materials to try, or sorry, plan labor to try to see which transactions are relevant to this particular user, you could do that. Yeah, so before save, after save, and after commit. So those are good questions. So these are actually newer launch point options. So if I go back to my EMX QBR All, I'll be super honest, I have never used the after commit scenario, so I can't actually give you a good example for that. Most of the time, you're going to be wanting to do before save. The big thing on the launch points is definitely choosing the events, whether it's add, update, or delete. For those that are super familiar with Maximo on a technical level, this will actually create event listeners so that as soon as that thing changes, Maximo will automatically call this automation script, similar to how it would function, say, with a published channel. Other events. So .new, .duplicate, and .save are three of the kind of undocumented features. Again, using .save doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense because you can do the launch points. And one of the downsides to using the name-based approach is, let's say I had multiple things that I wanted to default on LabTrans records. By doing this script name and having to match this exact format, the problem is that you can't actually have two scripts with the same name. The name has to be unique. So my two customizations now have to be inside of one script. And depending on how big that grows, that may not be a huge issue. But especially on like work orders as an example, a lot of people will try and build a ton of customizations around work orders. And when that happens, you really start to struggle because trying to maintain them all in one script, you typically have multiple people trying to manage that one script. And it becomes a lot harder. If you need to disable something, you're potentially having to strip stuff out. So it becomes a little bit trickier. When there is a launch point, I typically recommend going the launch point approach because it kind of gives you that flexibility where you can actually say, hey, you know, we can have 4 events on work order save, and I can explicitly disable this particular script only and allow these other 3 work. So those are the only 3 currently. My understanding is in 7612, there's actually going to be a new one that's pretty cool about for capturing actual Maximo errors. So if you're looking for a specific Maximo error code, being able to generate from that. The other ones that don't really kind of have launch points really tie more into integrations. So all the different integration ones are name-based as well. Those make a little more sense because just like Java classes, you're kind of limited, right? You have an object structure processing class, or you don't, you can't really have 2 of them. So the object structure approach is not as concerning as standard MBOs. Can you make fields read-only based on the logged in user's role/person group? Absolutely. So automation scripts are really great. That also potentially ties into things like global data restrictions or even security group data restrictions. And so it kind of depends on what your logic is to determine which is the right one there. A lot of times we recommend using data restrictions if possible. There are some limitations with automation scripts, such as, you know, they're not going to fire when you're in admin mode, as an example. So if something needs to fire when you're in admin mode, that's not going to really work. And because you're trying to make something read-only based on certain criteria that should be pretty easy to do with a SQL statement, then it's kind of better to use something like a data restriction. But there are use cases where we definitely make something read-only or editable based on some other criteria, based on logged in user, based on the state of that record. Constants like 2L, 11L. Yeah, so great questions. So MBO constants is kind of a big thing, and what you'll see that I will always try to use in all of my scripts is I will explicitly call out MBO constants and then reference exactly what it is. A lot of times if you're looking at Java code, you'll see literal numeric values of 2L, 11L, 7L, etc. And so like 2L as an example is a no access check, meaning that if something is read only, I don't actually care. I still want to be able to set that value. So I always import MBO constants and literally say MBO constants.no access check instead of using 2L. But that would technically work the same way in an automation script. 11L is suppressing access check, validation, and action. So if you're setting an attribute, the obvious thing, the access check really is pretty easy. If it's read-only, by suppressing the access check, you still be able to set it. But the validation and action are 2 steps that are kind of important. And occasionally, actually one of my later examples will suppress validation for a particular reason. But validation and action, you don't want to suppress too often because those typically are trying to do something else. So like, for example, if you're trying to set asset number on work order, some stuff actually happens behind the scenes when that occurs. Potentially could set GL accounts, could set locations, etc. And if you suppressed, well, I don't know, remember if they do it on validation or action. Properly, they should do it on action, but out of the box, I can't remember which one they do it on. So if you suppress the action, that stuff wouldn't happen. And especially when you're dealing with out of the box code, that becomes really tricky. Same thing with validation, right? If you suppress validation and something really should be a positive number, you may accidentally have a bug in your code and now all of a sudden you're putting something as a negative number that should never have been there. So anytime you're really trying to suppress validation or action, it really has to be done very sparingly, and you have to understand the ramifications of that choice, especially when it comes to core Maximo code. Now, if you're setting something that is purely custom, the odds of you knowing what the impacts are much higher, and maybe you don't want your particular automation script to fire, and so suppressing action or validation in that scenario is okay. MBR. So the MBR scripting language is a newer thing inside of Maximo and is really kind of intended for the multi-tenant Maximo. We don't see a lot of people using it because there are limits, especially with how it comes to looping and stuff like that. But if you're interested, there is a good guide, I think, that Anameter built that kind of walks through MBR scripting. It's there for people, especially if they're not really comfortable with writing code. It definitely helps solve some of the problems and ensures that you're not doing an infinite loop, especially if you're deploying something to prod and you haven't well tested it. The last thing you want to do is get stuck in an infinite loop, because the only way to fix it is to restart the system. It's really easy, especially when you're iterating through a set. Like if I went and I said while labor MBO instead of an if here, then all of a sudden, if I forgot to go to the next record and I don't get that null labor MBO, that thing would just loop forever. And the only way to fix it would be to restart. So there's some really good protections there. Like I said, it's mainly intended initially for multi-tenant, where you just can't give them the full capabilities of Python or JavaScript because the ability to import the classes and potentially cause an infinite loop and stuff like that was just kind of too big for a multi-tenant solution. All right. Use cases for integration. Yeah, so integration, that I will talk about probably in a future one. Integrations are a huge topic, and then they require a lot of information. But integrations definitely are probably going to be one of my next topics, because to me, they're a really good use case of automation scripts. Can you get a field out of read-only when the out-of-the-box functionality wants the field to be read-only, such as most fields are set to read-only? Yes, in some cases, an out-of-the-box field may be read-only and you can change it. In all cases, you can typically suppress access check and still actually set the value in an automation script. But if you wanted the user to be able to change it, you potentially can change the read-only. It really kind of depends how it's made read-only, and I know that's kind of vague, but you may or may not be able to, depending. Debugging MBR code, great question. I don't actually use MBR myself, so I don't have a great way of how you would debug. I believe you can still use, I believe they still expose a logger. So I think you could still do at least the old school approach of logging at various parts in your script to figure out what's going on. Which scripting language do you recommend? So definitely to me, Python is by far my favorite scripting language. You'll see a lot of people do examples with JavaScript, especially when you're interacting with external data sources that are probably using JSON. But as far as for support going away of any languages, I'm not aware of any. Basically, the way that they built it is anything that's built off of JSR 221, if I remember correctly on the numbering scheme, can be used. So even though out of box they ship with Jython / Python, you'll see the script language say Python, but really it's Jython. Even though they ship with Jython and JavaScript out of box, you can use JRuby and a bunch of other options if you put it in there. You just need to load in that scripting language. Part of the reason why I prefer Python over JavaScript is there are some JavaScript naming restrictions that have caused issues in the past. With the new WebSphere 9 and Java 1.8, that changed the JavaScript engine. So what a lot of people are doing is they're loading a compatibility layer to kind of make their older scripts work. We've never really had any issues with that with Python. It's pretty easy to pick up. Some of it really comes down to just personal preference. There's not a right or wrong answer. I definitely, in general, would recommend just sticking with one of the two languages out of the box, unless you're really focused on trying to write on a particular language. I don't think loading in additional languages really makes sense. All right. So I'm going to start on a couple of more topics really quick. So I'm going to start this back up. Sorry, gotta skip through. All right, so deleting an object. So a lot of times you start to add in child objects, right? So you need to track some metric that IBM doesn't track out of the box. My favorite example is adding doc links to something that doesn't exist out of the box. So like, for example, and the example I'll cover in just a second, we wanted to add attachments to reports. So you may have specs that you built that try to describe what that report is intended to do. And that's what you got certified by your customer. And so something you may want to do is actually attach that to the report itself. But over time, as that report is no longer needed, you may actually remove that from your Maximo system. And if you don't build in some additional processing, that doc link reference will stay. So the nice part is, unlike in Java class where you're going to be doing deletes and undeletes based on whether or not they're toggling deletes, on the save event, you know you only need to do this and it is actually going to be deleted, so your logic's a little bit simpler as well. And of course, whether or not you should allow somebody to delete a record. So again, I tried to pick another out-of-the-box example that really annoys me, and that is Maximo, for some reason, allows you to delete a PM. And after it's generated work order, in my mind, that record shouldn't be allowed to be deleted. You can't delete a job plan after it's been used on a work order. Why can you delete the PM? So unfortunately, that's not a bug. That's how IBM intends it. But with a little simple automation script, you can kind of prevent that. If that use case makes sense to for your organization, you can kind of go in there and say, hey, if this record has been used to generate a work order, don't allow somebody to delete this record. It's another really simple example. So I'm going to kind of talk through these really quick. Let's demo these. So we'll start with the report. And again, this one is a really simple, just save event, delete, again, before save. And what I'm doing here is, in my example, this is something to be super aware of. My example, because reports didn't have doc links out of the box, I set it up, I created it. The only relationship is to that particular record. I go through and I delete every single record that's part of that set. Now, if you were on, say, work order as an int, for example, this would be a terrible thing. Ignoring that IBM already does this automatically. If you delete doc links, they actually display doc links for PMs and assets and locations and all kinds of other supporting records. So you have to be aware of what you're trying to do. But in this case, because the only attachments associated to that particular report are the ones associated to it directly, I can safely go in and say delete all. And then as that record again gets saved, my doc link information gets deleted. Standard doc link logic that fires will go and check to see if that doc info is referenced anywhere else. If so, it leaves the file on the file system. If not, it deletes the file from the file system. So it's kind of a good way to do that. And then on the can delete. So again, on PM, this one is a allow object deletion event. Similarly, there's an allow object creation. So like if you're on PO line, for instance, and you want to prevent somebody from being able to add on additional lines, you would use the allow object creation. But in this case, we're going to say allow object deletion. And again, all I'm going to check is something really simple. I could go and actually look to see if there are any work orders that have ever been generated against that PM by going to the actual work order table. For this particular example, I just did the dumb approach and the simple approach, which is if the last start date on the PM has been set, we know we can't delete it because that means it's at least generated one work order, maybe millions, maybe 10. It doesn't really matter. But this is the first time in one of our scripts that we want to display a message to the user. So displaying messages to the user is super important. You don't want to just throw a generic error because users get super frustrated, especially when something is like read-only. It just tells you, hey, you can't delete this record. It doesn't typically tell you why. And so we find a lot of times people will get really frustrated because while the underlying rule makes sense, it's not exactly discoverable to the user. So we try to always build custom messages that are really specific as to why you can't do this. So you can configure messages in one of two places. It's either going to be database configuration or application designer. I typically, out of habit, always go to database configuration. Doesn't really matter, they go to the same place. You should always set up a message group that is unique to you. So for most of our customizations, we use the Emacs prefix, but again, whatever makes sense for you. Two other important parts to highlight. This message ID prefix, there are many options. The only valid option for a customer should be BMXZZ. So anytime you're doing something as a user, this is what you should use. Out of box, all these other ones are going to be used. And the last thing you want to do is have different numbers, because if you start to do a search and try to find your particular error message and figure out, hey, this is not actually a core Maximo issue, this is an us issue, it's really helpful to just be able to see that prefix and say, hey, this is something we did. And so what I'm doing here is by putting in this curly bracket 0, I'm telling this message that I'm going to put in a value here from either my JavaScript or my Java class or my automation script. And this is going to be helpful to the user. And the reason why I'm doing this to display the PM number is if you're doing something in bulk, like let's say you're trying to delete using MX Loader or something else like that, it's really helpful to have a specific record being referenced. You don't always need to do that, especially like if you're in the context of a PO line, right? Like you don't need to really talk about the PO necessarily because you're working on a PO line. But if somebody's trying to do something in bulk, make it really obvious, hey, PM blah has been used to generate work order and cannot be deleted. And then we get into a couple of implicit variables, and so service is in almost every case in Maximo going to be exposed on the automation scripts, and it'll allow you to do useful stuff like logging, or in this case throwing an error, so that if this criteria matches, we're going to immediately throw an error, and because we're throwing an error and they can delete, nothing will actually be allowed to be deleted. So if I go to one of our PM records and I try to delete something that's actually generated a record, so what is my test PM? Don't actually know. Yeah, so go and delete. So this gives me my custom error message, hey, this record has been used to generate a work order and cannot be deleted. Out of box, because that this PM has no open work orders, Maximo would have technically allowed that to be deleted. So this kind of helps prevent that from being the case. All right. Go back to the slides really quick for attribute lookups. So I'm just going to quickly go into, we're not going to talk about table and crossover domain. We're running a little bit low on time. So I'll just start right here. Slideshow, start from current slide. All right, so automation scripts have this concept of retrieve list, and if you're familiar with Java, it's the same as get list. And essentially, the main use case for this is when you really need to do conditional base filters. So a table domain or crossover domain works really well in a lot of cases, but if typically you want to filter based on some criteria. So like for instance, let's say you typically want to filter based on the org ID, but you're on the list tab or on the advanced search, you don't actually have a concept of an org ID there. And so what typically happens is your lookup would be completely empty. And so when someone's trying to search on the list tab / advanced search, you've basically made that lookup completely worthless. With automation scripts in Java, you can actually check by determining whether or not your record is a zombie as to whether or not it's on the advanced search or not, and then have different filters appropriately. I'm not a huge fan of the second option, which is trying to support values from multiple objects in a single field. But there are use cases, even out of the box, where IBM does this on a related record. Your record key could either be related to a work order, it could be a ticket-based object like SR or incident. Same thing with work log. Service provider adds some additional fields on the person record, and they have a single field for customer and/or vendor. Like it's kind of weird. And then based on some other field, it determines whether you're going to be looking for a customer or vendor. There are some use cases where that may make sense, and that kind of enables you to do that. But that, again, is not super common. It's typically more in the conditional-based filtering, especially if you're trying to get something from parent MBOs that may or may not be saved in the database. It's a great way to be able to do that. Key thing to be aware of is it replaces existing configuration. And what I mean by that is you really need to be careful when you use this on out-of-the-box attributes. You can't just put an if statement and try to restrict it only to certain things. It will replace the configuration, which means that, you know, if you try to do this on work order asset number, your filter needs to be able to work completely. Otherwise, whatever they try to do in the out-of-the-box asset lookup, that would be an issue. So I'm going to walk through this one in just a second. So Emacs related work order. So the use case here is relatively straightforward, but out of box, when you're trying to search for related records and specifically trying to find a related work order, there's not a great way to do that. And the reason is that record key field, which is the persistent field where the work order number gets stored, is primarily designed for tickets. So if you try to do a lookup against it, it's going to show you ticket-based information. So what we kind of did in this example, based on a forum post I saw yesterday, is I just really quickly came in, I created a new attribute on related record. So I created this Emacs related wonum, and this one is actually persistent, unlike the non-persistent wonum field that exists out of the box. And as that record gets added, I copy over the non-persistent wonum field into my persistent wonum field. And then inside of this automation script, I allow that lookup. So I basically, it's a bunch of implicit variables like relation object, such as, you know, which object to go against, in this case, work order. If it was conditional, I could definitely have if statements that check and then say relation object equals work order or relation object equals ticket based on some other criteria. The main thing is making sure that your variable names are what they need to be. Relation where is how you kind of join them. So if you're familiar with table domains and crossover domains, it's really that validation where clause. And then you get into the bottom, which is kind of the list where clause. So is zombie is going to make no sense to a lot of people, but essentially it's a good way to tell, hey, I'm on the list tab where I don't really have a true MBO. And this allows you to kind of alter your lookup. So in this case, I'm only trying to filter for history flag and task. But if I was actually on a record, I'm also going to apply the site ID based filter. So that way I'm only picking stuff inside the same site. Source keys and target keys, similar to if you're doing a crossover domain, these basically say, hey, take attribute A from our source object, our relation object, and put them in our particular attributes on this object. As you can tell, it is a list of values, so I could put in wonum and site ID, for instance, and on the second one, put in a site ID attribute. It can be as many attributes as you want, just like on crossover domain. So it's kind of a good way. And then what this allows me to do is I'm here, and I'm going to see everything, not just stuff for a particular site. So if I search for, I see a bunch of Bedford, but if I search for Boston, these are work orders in the Boston site. And so now people have the ability to kind of filter for stuff that is associated to work orders that they may be interested in. I think I did this one as an example, but hopefully, yeah. So in this case, I related 1000 to 1024. So if I go to my related records, you'll actually be able to see that, yep, I related that to 1000. So it's not the best in the case that you're building logic to be able to support this use case. But if you really want to be able to search and actually have that lookup, this is a relatively low-hanging fruit to kind of implement. How can you call multiple objects in the script without using the relationship to pull fields? Would you need to build a lookup for the lookup columns? Yeah, so when I say the multiple objects, like the related record key concept, essentially you'd have to figure out what the criteria is. So in the case of the customer vendor thing on person and service provider, there's literally another attribute that says you're going to be looking for a customer or a vendor. And what you would do is you basically do an if statement and say if MBO.getString, this other attribute, then relation object equals work order, else relationship or relation object equals ticket, as an example. So it really kind of would depend. The actual lookup, so the dialog that gets displayed in, say, work order tracking, that is a trickier thing. So I actually have an RFE out there because there is a Java class method that allows you to dynamically set that. We don't have that capability in just automation scripts. So from a pure lookup perspective, it's a little bit tricky. In the case of ticket and work order, you may be okay trying to deal with work view as an example. That's an object that has both of them in it. But yeah, the actual controlling of a lookup would have to be done. Like if I wanted this to be ticket or work order, and I was actually on a record, I could actually dynamically change the lookup that's here based on the record. It's actually a really cool functionality that unfortunately can't be done with a script, but hopefully that RFE gets implemented. Is filtering all site data there be any performance issues? Yeah, so anytime you're not filtering out based on something like site on a table like work order, definitely can be performance issues. So this is a basic demo app, and I'm courageous enough to be able to do all records because there are only 6,600 records. We have customer systems with many, many, many millions of records. So you have to be careful. Work order lookups don't always make sense. There's a reason why out of the box, the work order field doesn't have a lookup. So try to filter as much as you can. Again, being a demo app, putting history flagging his task is plenty. It's only 6,600 records in total. When you write and you want them on your custom field and create record and relation record object. Yeah, so in my case, I'm really more just piggybacking on the core functionality. So I only display in this example on the advanced search. We're not even actually setting it on the related records. So what we do there is to basically populate it. I just created a simple automation script on save of related records to just copy the value over from a related rec one into our custom field. Good questions. I'm very appreciative of all the questions. I am very, very much not a trainer, so I am much more of an interactive person, so I appreciate it. All right, the last one, I'm not going to bring up the PowerPoint slide because we just have a few more minutes and I still want to leave more time for questions. Can you read out questions? Oh, yes, appreciate the feedback, and I apologize for I skimmed through the questions and you guys can't see the questions, so I apologize for that. So the last thing, I'm not going to bring up the PowerPoint slide. Again, I'll send it to you. But the last option is for actions. So actions are a huge use case for us when it comes to automation scripts. They can be used in a lot of scenarios. Typically, we see them used inside of an application, either as a more actions or push button control. But they can also be used in background processes such as workflow or escalations. In 761 and above, they actually make it even more powerful because when you're inside of that application, that action event actually now allows you to interact with the UI. And what I mean by that is things like launching a dialog, interacting with the bean classes to actually call methods or functions on those bean classes. We've even had some scenarios where we've had some weird bugs where a data set didn't properly show new records when we were going through the same relationship in an automation script. And so what we literally did is we actually effectively were clicking the new row button from our automation script, and that allowed us to actually put in the values, and they showed up immediately. Someone didn't have to save the record. So I'm going to really quickly show the grant all security option. So this use case is pretty simple. When we're doing demo apps or someone's trying to test something out in Maximo and Dev, you really don't want to sit there and try to grant every single option. There's so many applications, especially once you start getting into industry solutions. So this is not something that I would quote unquote consider production use case because it doesn't support work centers properly. You really need to apply templates and stuff like that. But if you're just trying to do basic evaluation, this is a really good time saver. All this is doing is inside the security group application, I'm iterating through the apps, creating the standard 4 permissions that are up at the top, read, save, insert, delete, and then I'm going and getting all the other options and enabling those. So that could be, whether or not you're able to run reports or view the query settings or change status or any of those other options. So that stuff's pretty straightforward. The big thing is we make sure that the thing is not read-only. Maximo out of box will show certain permissions in a read-only state that require a license key. So we definitely try to check that. We also explicitly don't override access checks because of that, to ensure that even if for some reason this didn't work, that we're not setting something that we typically would not be able to set. Start center portlets are super weird, and that one of the permissions underneath them is to actually hide the portlet. So when you grant a permission, you actually lose access to something. So it's a little counterintuitive. So we make sure that it's not that one because we don't want to set that. But otherwise, we set it. Because we're not trying to do this in any particular order, options have the ability to be define prerequisites, meaning that you need permission A before you can have permission B. Instead of trying to deal with all of that, we just suppress validation in this particular scenario. Again, it's not really used in production systems. It's really kind of meant to allow us to grant options quickly so that we can evaluate a bunch of different applications. But the other cool part that this does, and I wish I had more time to cover, is this does interactively ask the user. So when you're doing an action, you have to potentially be careful, right? Sometimes people accidentally click something and you want to ask, are you sure you want to do this? So automation scripts have this concept of a yes, no, cancel error. Really, it's more yes, no, cancel. I don't know why they flag it as yes, no, cancel error, but again, you display a message. So in this case, I have this Emacs confirm grant all security that I configure in here. And this will ask the user, hey, do you want to do this? And then on this message, instead of having the OK button like you would for a traditional error, I actually enable the yes, no options. And then from there, based on what somebody provides, if they say yes, we go into the grant all yes function, and this will do all the logic to add all the permissions. If they say no, we just do a really basic log, hey, they decided not to do this. And if they haven't picked, then we go and we do our yes, no, cancel dialog. So if I go into, let's go into security groups really quick, and we'll just create a new group, and I'll say test, and if I execute the option, gives me the warning, hey, do you want to grant all options to the security group? I say yes. It'll take a second because we have a ton of permissions, but if I go into here, now instead of having to go through and say grant listed options for this application for every application, this will automatically go through and add it. And so it's just a really simple way to kind of save some time without having to go through and try to migrate all of these permissions. So yeah. So go back to some questions. Using Python and setting checkbox to check unchecked sometimes will not work on Maximo. Is it related to synchronous property? Yeah, so if your automation script is not reliably firing or someone's able to, it could definitely be related to synchronous. In your particular case, you mentioned the question was using Python on setting checkboxes to checked or unchecked sometimes does not work on Maximo 7.5. Is it related to the synchronous property? So Maximo 7.5 added the capability for controls to be asynchronous, meaning that you can change the value and then in the background, Maximo actually sends it to the server, which may or may not set other attributes. It's potentially related to synchronous. It's not clear to me in your example if you're setting a checkbox attribute, like you're setting a yarn attribute in your script and it's not checking it, or someone is checking it and your script's not firing. So I'm not entirely sure there. Do you kind of piggyback from the class file to write your script? Does that help? Definitely one of the things that I do a lot is I definitely look at the out-of-the-box Maximo codes. So I get comfortable with Java decompiler. I also have a resources link that will cover the Maximo Java docs. And honestly, the communities. I'm actually going to put up this slide really quick while I answer questions because I think this one is useful. So definitely try to go to the communities. It's a great place to ask questions. Definitely try to make an effort yourself. But if you have questions, go to the more community, go to the IBM community. Definitely look at the IBM Java docs, even though they're a little bit outdated because this only shows for 7.609. It's still extremely helpful to know what functions and methods are available without having to decompile Java. I also put in the MaxTech user group. So automation scripts definitely fall under a more technical audience. And the MaxTech user group is really good for that. BPD Zenith kind of helps lead that, and they do a lot of good community events. Unfortunately, with this year, a lot of the in-person events are obviously postponed. But if you ever have a chance, it's definitely a good place to learn more information as well. Does action automation scripts work on a dialog box? Yes, one of the things, if you're not on 7.6.1 though, that was really annoying with actions is that you couldn't close the dialog box. So you could do your logic, but then you would have to have someone close the dialog box. If you're on 7.6.1 or higher, because you're able to interact with the UI, you can actually close that dialog after your processing is done. Do you modify any XML in your automation script editor? No. So the automation script editor in 7.6.1 adds a lot of syntax highlighting. So everything that you see there is pure out of the box 7.6.1 and above of Maximo. If you're really interested, you can deploy it, I think, on 7.6.09 and above. IBM it's not officially supported on earlier versions, but they came out with kind of an ad hoc release that you could kind of put in. But once you get to 7.6.1, it's automatic. Can we suppress the logic which is written in Java code like 11L MBO constant? Yes. If you want to suppress logic when you set a value or do no access check on a set, all that can still be done. Again, try to avoid using 11L or 2L, or try to avoid using the numbers. But yeah, if you import the MBO constants, you can definitely do all those. Do you have any examples of an automation script which deals with security header, adding namespace, and outbound XML? So that's a great question for the integration one. I will try to make sure we make a note of that. I'm trying to come up with good topics for when we do the integration ones because it is such a large topic. So if you have specific use cases like that, that's really good. We definitely will talk about endpoints in general, which would be helpful for that. Some of it may be better as a XSLT to kind of do some of the transformation. It kind of really depends on your use case. When we copy a script into Automation Script Editor, it will be in plain text, but your editor looks different. Thanks in advance. Correct. Yeah, if you're not on 7.6.1 or above, it will show as plain text for you, but you will have the nice color formatting once you get to 7.6.1 on both JavaScript and Python. Can we add max admin group to grant permission instead of writing this script? If we add max admin group to grant permission instead of writing this script. Yeah, so don't quite understand that question. Max admin doesn't automatically get all the permissions, but it does get a lot of them. So even with max admin, you still occasionally have to grant permissions to max admin, especially as new releases come out, new permissions get added. A lot of times IBM will define those permissions as something that gets automatically granted based on access to other permissions. So for instance, if you need to have save access to work order tracking for permission A, they may automatically grant you permission A if you have save access to work order tracking. It depends on how they configure it. But max admin does not automatically get everything out of the box. In this demo app, if I get out of this really quick, I did not run this on max admin. And this is a demo app which gives it more permissions than normal. But I bet you if I go, we're going to be missing certain permissions. Or did I actually run this? I may have actually ran this out of box. Let's see, Maximo management interface. That one's not normally granted. Oh yeah, so apparently I ran this already for max admin. So bad example, but traditionally max admin does not have all the permissions. All right, I apologize for everybody that we ran over. I appreciate all the questions. It's been good feedback. If you guys have any other questions, I really want to make this a series of informative information formative material. So I much prefer if you have specific questions, please send them out to us. We'd love to go over your specific examples and hopefully help other people out as well. Again, I thank you for all your time. Have a great day.